Hey, hello everyone. Hopefully your day's off to a good start. Today we're going to take a look at the 1950s and 60s final exam review questions, focusing in primarily on the Cold War, but also other issues that are hitting the 1960s. When you look at the 50s and 60s, you have President Truman until January 1953, President Eisenhower for the majority of the 1950s, and then John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson for the majority of the 1960s. So we'll be looking at first the Cold War, the kind of the origin, why the United States and Soviet Union kind of emerged as adversaries. When you think about World War II and kind of reflect back, obviously they were unlikely allies during the war. They had a common enemy, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. But when you think about communism and capitalism, they kind of naturally come into conflict with each other. The leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, was a totalitarian dictator, very brutal in nature. And when he helped to liberate uh, Eastern Europe from Nazi control, his troops never left Eastern Europe. And as we had learned previously, the Soviet Union had an iron curtain descend upon Eastern Europe. When you think about the Iron Curtain, those Eastern European countries were basically trapped under Soviet domination. Competition in those areas between the United States and the Soviet Union, capitalism in the United States and freedom versus the Soviet Union, communism and totalitarianism. They competed in the arms race. Initially, it was to build up the first atomic bomb. Over the course of time, it would be nuclear weapons. So you had the arms race, building up their military. You had the space race. So this involved putting the first person into orbit. It involved the first satellites. It involved rocket and missile technologies, and even the missiles were designed to deliver nuclear warheads eventually across the globe with the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Territorial expansion, the Soviet Union wished to extend communism across the globe, whereas the United States looked to contain it or keep it where it was. There's also spy related activities or subversion on both sides. And again, as we're going through, feel free to add additional responses down for your questions to help you best prepare for the final exam, which is kind of ultimately our goal. When you think about Cold War policies that developed during this period of time, right after World War II, we had to rebuild Western Europe. There was a lot of concern that if we didn't help out and rebuild Western Europe after World War II, they might turn to the Soviet Union and all of Europe might come under Soviet domination. Uh, as time went on, as different areas became communist, the broad policy of the United States became the policy of containment. We weren't going to go in and liberate and free the Soviet Union from communist control. And then when China fell to communism in 1949, which was the first failure of this policy of containment, we wanted to kind of stop the spread of communism there. So contain was the idea that came out of George Kennan, who was kind of the foremost expert of the Soviet Union during this period of time and of communism. Additionally, you had a circumstance where the president of the time, when the Cold War started, Harry Truman, issued the Truman Doctrine, saying the United States would aid those countries which were looking to resist the spread of communism, first in Greece and Turkey, later on in different parts of the globe. Later on, President Eisenhower's policy of brinkmanship, he, along with the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, they kind of came up with the idea that you may have to go to the very brink of war to actually deter war. And there was also mutually assured destruction. This is the philosophy that neither side would use nuclear or atomic weapons because they knew that eventually their country would be destroyed as well. Three, how did the fear of the Soviet Union and communism impact American culture and society? How did Joseph McCarthy fuel the Red Scare? Well, acute paranoia hit the United States in the aftermath of World War II and the start of the Cold War. HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities Committee, was established to deal with spy related activities or subversion. When the Soviet Union developed the atomic bomb in 1949, much sooner than any military experts believed they could, it was kind of clear that those plans for the atomic bomb were stolen from the United States. Wisconsin Senator, who was a Republican, Joseph McCarthy, exploited Cold War fears. He helped to create the Red Scare, where Americans, often falsely so, were accused of being communists. Many people lost their careers, went to prison, lost their jobs, all during the Red Scare. And if you're branded a communist during this period of time in history, it's very difficult to walk that back. Once as they say, the genie's out of the bottle, it's difficult for you to kind of go back and say, hey, I'm not a communist. Nobody would believe you. 4, examined gender roles in the 1950s and had a TV. I guess the involvement of TV is we went from very few people to having most people by the end of the 1950s with TVs in their homes. During the 1950s, as kind of the baby boom generation was growing up into their single digits and teens, societal norms promoted what is called like a nuclear family, mom staying at home, prepping meals, taking care of the house, not going to work. Dad would go to work, make the money for the home, come home, and then mom would have dinner ready to go for the dad and the children. Most early TV programs during the 1950s reinforced these stereotypical family values and traditional gender roles. And most women, although maybe they might have been dissatisfied, kind of remained kind of quiet during the 1950s. Then during the early 1960s, Betty Friedan released the book Feminine Mystique. This is kind of the turning point for women, was this book. Not everybody, it's not like in 1963 the book's released and then women have equal rights and equal footing within society instantaneously, but it slowly but surely begins to push the movement forward. Friedan theorized in her book that many women, although quiet about it, were dissatisfied or felt somewhat limited in their everyday lives as homemakers within society, but at that point in time were too afraid to speak up. However, by the end of the 1960s, the women's movement began to grow and people became more confident to speak out. And in some ways, the different civil rights movements in the 1960s were interrelated. As African Americans were fighting for their rights, women began to realize too they were lacking some of these rights as well. Two of the early civil rights leaders, at least during the civil rights movement in the mid 1900s, 1950s, and 60s, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Parks and MLK really, spearheaded the start of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, of course, refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King gained national attention as he helped to coordinate carpooling and rides and things like that as they boycotted the buses in Montgomery, and it kind of worked through the church community where MLK was a local preacher. They emphasized, of course, nonviolent and peaceful protest throughout the 1950s and 60s. Now, not everybody agreed with MLK's approach. This included the more militant Black Power movement that emerged in the 1960s. Many of the leaders in this group here had grown tired of being told to be patient. Many of them kind of mentioned the idea they had been patient for their entire lives, and as such, they didn't want to be patient any longer. Malcolm X was the most influential thinker of what became known as the Black Power movement. X inspired others like Stokely Carmichael of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Huey Newton and Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers Party to kind of stand up a little bit more aggressively for their rights. They were more militant. You can see even the dress and style there and the image. And they had grown tired, as I mentioned earlier, of the very patient approach. Okay, next, we'll look at some of the events surrounding Cuba. First thing we need to understand is that Fidel Castro, he was the leader of Cuba for a long period of time, 1959 to 2008. He instilled a communist government in 1959 as he overthrew the longtime dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista. When John F. Kennedy came into the presidency in January 1961, he inherited a plan from the Eisenhower administration. They were training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba in hopes of deposing Fidel Castro as a leader. Kennedy being a very young president, youngest ever elected, and also somebody who, kind of gave in almost to peer pressures. We always say that even as young people don't give in to the peer pressures within society, he did feel pressured, and he kind of pushed forward with like a plan that he wasn't 100% behind. Turned out to be an utter disaster, as the United States was aiding these Cuban rebels who were invading at the Bay of Pigs. Bay of Pigs located here on the map, southern Cuba. Keep in mind, Cuba is less than 100 miles from southern Florida. So as a result of communist dictator being in Cuba, this is seen as a direct threat to American security. So after the failed attempt, Kennedy kind of went in with one arm tied behind his back. The United States military is supposed to provide logistical support when the Cuban rebels won ashore at the Bay of Pigs. We did not. We kind of held back the military support. And the Cuban rebels were either killed or imprisoned, all of whom were captured or killed. So this was a disaster for the Kennedy administration. He looked really strong, though, in the aftermath because Kennedy went on national TV, took responsibility, said the buck stops with him, and he actually looked like a strong leader by taking responsibility. He did learn from his mistakes, however, as he would make his own decisions rather than relying on others for advice. The advice for the Bay of Pigs came from the Defense Department and military leaders. In 1963, actually, let me amend that year there for you. 1962. 1962, JFK learned from his mistakes, making his own decisions rather than relying on the Defense Department for advice. When we found out that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missile sites in Cuba, the military leadership wanted the United States to either invade Cuba or bomb Cuba, and Kennedy kind of held back, instead developing a third option. He ordered a blockade in October of 1962. For 13 days, we blockaded the water, as you can see there, in the Atlantic and Caribbean around Cuba, preventing the Soviet Union from bringing the nuclear armaments to arm those missiles in Cuba. Eventually, the Soviet Union turned around and we averted what could have very possibly been World War III. The United States and Soviet Union made a kind of behind the scenes deal. John F. Kennedy promised if Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, would pull his missiles out of Cuba, we would pull our missiles 6 months later out of Turkey, which would be a helpful thing for the Soviet Union, and that's what we did. And John F. Kennedy's strong leadership here prevented World War III. Next, we'll look at the Kennedy assassination. John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald. Kennedy, of course, was traveling in the convertible car there. We see there in the photograph. He, along with Governor Connolly, seated in front of him, were both shot. Jackie Kennedy in the pink, seated next to John F. Kennedy, was also in the car, and Governor Connolly's wife is there as well, although you can't see her in the photograph. Kennedy had stopped in Texas during this period of time for a re-election tour to kind of promote his re-election as president. Many conspiracy theories emerged as to why John F. Kennedy was assassinated and who was behind it. Eventually, a Warren Commission was put together, chaired by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, as well as many members of Congress, including future President Gerald Ford. They released a several hundred-page document indicating that Lee Harvey Oswald indeed was the lone assassin or gunman. Still to this day, a lot of controversy surrounds that. Not everybody actually believes the findings of the committee. Then lastly, President Johnson, his Great Society, War on Poverty, and Medicare programs. They're all part of it and kind of interrelated. LBJ, as we had studied in class, was from humble origins, middle lower class family, very much living in poverty at different points in time. So he had a lot of compassion towards impoverished people. Also, too, his very first job in society as an adult was as a teacher in a low-income area, so he had a lot of compassion towards those who struggled. As president, he sought a broad idea to create a great society for all Americans, believing all Americans should have access to bare necessities. Later on, declaring a war on poverty with a series of programs to lift more than 20 million Americans out of poverty. Perhaps his greatest long-term legacy is the Medicare health insurance program, which continues to provide health insurance for senior citizens. Again, use this information to best prepare for the final exam as you kind of move forward towards hopefully a successful US2 final exam. Any questions, you feel free to just reach out. Mr. Clark is out.